what I would like to talk with you about today is what I roughly term cybernetic governance. And now, to some of you, that might be already coming as a bit of a tautology, because of course, many of you know cybernetics. Norbert Wiener, as Dirk yesterday mentioned, comes from the Greek term kybernan, kybernan meaning steersman or boatsman, and the word governance comes from gubernare, which traces back to the Greek word kybernan, which means steersman and boatsman. So cybernetic governance really means steering. Now, if I wanted to be very nifty, and you will see that this is also what happened eventually in my research, then you would think, oh, it's about steering elements, meta cybernetics, so to speak. Now, I'll be briefly introducing you to my work, talk a little bit about what are the foundations of governance. What does it mean when we talk about cybernetic governance? I'll be touching upon aspects that Dirk also pioneered together with his colleague Jenka on technology convergence. And we'll look a little bit at what does it mean for us as political scientists, political theorists, lawyers, when we see these technologies converging. What does it mean legally? Because you can imagine that every technological package comes with its legal package. So what does it do to us where we are not so tech-affine as many of you? Now, what is it all about? When we go back to the post-war era, we have one foundational article written by Hans Kelsen. Hans Kelsen, Austrian political theorist and lawyer, also one of the writers of the Austrian Constitution. He wrote a landmark article in the Journal of Ethics, Cambridge Journal, one of the oldest Cambridge journals. And it's quite unique because it was a two-part special issue. Part one was solely dedicated to his article, which was more than 100 pages long. So that gives you an impression how much the Cambridge Journal and the editors there valued his opinion. It was the first article. And in this article, he laid out the foundations of what a good democracy should provide. It should provide individual freedom, it should provide collective freedom, and it should provide equality. And he lays out throughout this article how the different philosophical transitions can be traced back to support those principles. Roughly at the same time, 3 years later, Ashby, in the field of cybernetics, comes up with this law of requisite variety. Now, I probably don't have to explain it to you, but within control theory, the law of requisite variety, and please correct me if I misrepresent it, roughly explains that the more variables are joining, the more there are disturbances, the more you need controls to control for errors. And when I read that, I thought, well, that is interesting because that has implications for law as well. The more complex our societies become, the more complex our laws need to become. And if that is true, we are heading towards a trajectory where traditional lawyers will have a rough time understanding even what is going on in their own field, namely law. So Ashby predicted that only variety can destroy variety. Briefly about governance. Governance is the art of regulating human behavior, and governance can be done through many means. Law is but one of them, but we find policies, we find nowadays incentive mechanisms such as tax breaks, etc. There's many ways of how we can steer people, and some of which Dirk has yesterday summarized: steering through nudging and so forth. But traditionally, governance can be viewed as what we nowadays would call old governance. Command and control hierarchical structures. We have the state on top. The state creates laws and policies, and that trickles down to the citizens, and the citizens then have to abide by it. And if they don't, well, then there's always the executive to bring us back in line. This was the traditional view of governance. But as time progressed, so did also the concept of governance. New governance, the term coming up in the late 1990s, 2000s, is the idea that the state doesn't always have to be in the dominant position and downstreaming every single aspect of our lives. The state can also, for example, delegate. It can delegate authority, for example, for standard making, and dishes it out to the industry and says, well, dear industry, you know best which standards you might want. USB, for example, is such a standard. Come to an agreement, and together you will set a standard which we then, as a governing body, will further certify. So that is also a form of governance, and you will see, or we saw that in this new form of governance, many kinds of governance came up, such as public-private governance, non-autonomous self-governance. So that would be, for example, the idea of standard setting, but also autonomous self-governance, where the governing body simply says, we'll leave it up to you. You make up your ideas, but we will then afterwards judge you based on that. So code of conduct and best practices are amongst them. And we see that now with the best practices being developed in the European Union for the AI Act. I'm in this committee, which sounds better than it is, because in this committee there are, I think, 400 people, half of which ever show up, and you know, in the end, probably the wisdom of the crowd will steer us in the right direction, but let's see. And then in 2000, together with my PhD student, Gilles Hasenberg, we realized with these upcoming new models of blockchain, of DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations that also require some sort of a decentralized ledger technology, new forms of governance can emerge. They already emerged within networked society, specifically facilitated through social media, such as Facebook. But we found that we can actually look at governance also through a network perspective. And that would open up a few possibilities. For one, it allows us to view power and the roles that different stakeholders take differently. No longer do we need the state as the one rule maker or the agenda setter. We can have different actors in a network depending on the centrality, depending on how powerful they are in the network, taking on different roles. And when we understand such a network better, then we can look at what is going wrong with this network. Why do certain stakeholders hold more power over others? And how can we bridge, for example, structural holes? So there are holes in the network that can be closed in order to make the network more dense. How can we close them strategically for forming new alliances in order to make the process more democratic? So we thought network analysis can be really a tool for governance, for lawmakers and regulators, of how we can facilitate lawmaking in a decentralized system. So that would also give the state, in our prediction, a new role. the role of a platform builder. And as a platform builder, you can bring together those stakeholders that are yet to be connected, that lack the edges that other actors might have that wield power. Now, we see thus the different modes of regulation changing. We start with laws, contracts, policy, very traditionally, but then with Mode 2 governance, we see it opening up. Co-regulation standards, multi-stakeholder agreements, and so forth. But with this introduction of digitalized, facilitated network building, we find also new ways in which law can be created. And I mean, you are all familiar with Lessig's work on Code is Law. But quite honestly, it goes even deeper than that. Because not only code is law, we found, but also just user interfaces are law. And we saw that very prominently with Facebook. Facebook decided we want users to have a good experience. So other than YouTube, we will not create a down button, but only an up button. That will create a positive user experience, and hence Facebook will become more popular. So this is a way to show how just the implementation of a user interface already creates regulatory mechanisms. And of course, with now the emergence of AI and blockchain, we have now the concepts evolving such as AI-driven smart contracts, digital twins, and so forth. So all modes through which we can steer individuals and a group of individuals and societies into a certain direction. This is what we predicted. What we also looked at was specifically decentralized autonomous organizations. And without having any empirical data at that time yet, we just speculated that what do people do when they can't get their way within the system? They will go outside the system. Now, I was lucky to come across Ziegler and Alter's work on network analysis of decentralized autonomous organizations because they found something really interesting that confirmed our hypothesis. They found that, you see in the top, that is a snapshot of a DAO network, a decentralized autonomous organization, with all its potential voting edges. In other words, when you have such a network, voting is based on your tokens that you hold. So the more tokens you hold, the more voting power you have. You see that in the size of the nodes. And what they found when comparing the potential voting with the actual asserting voting edges, that the actual participation dropped drastically. They came up with this 99-1 rule, and this 99-1 rule essentially means that most of the decisions in a DAO are being taken by the 9%, 90% stays silent on one single topic. So you see already that what we've envisioned with the DAOs, the revolutionary way of self-organizing ourselves, if only 10% actually participate, then democracy is nowhere near achieved. So democracy 2.0, I think, at least within the DAOs, shows us that it's not always working as we're expecting it to do. What we did, however, see, and that confirmed our prediction, is that a lot of what would otherwise happening on-chain, so on the blockchain, that was ruled out by the rules of the DAO, of the Decentralized Autonomous Organizations Network, was moved off-chain, namely onto the Discord servers. And so a lot of lobbying before the voting procedure happened there. Cybernetic governance then. So when these are the tools that we have to our avail to bring new life, so to speak, into democracy, then we should always also think back of what happens in the past. This is a faithful recreation of what Chile's cybersyn was supposed to look like. Maybe you have heard of cybersyn, sin with a Y, not with an I, but I think that could have been just as well written with an I. Cybersyn was the idea of cybernetic governance of a whole country of Chile from 71 till 73. Stafford Beer was involved in developing their system, and the idea was that we will run the whole country by code. We will run the whole country by getting the data from the factories of what they need and then automatically managing the supply chain, managing the contracts with the workers and so forth. This project ended with the toppling of the military leadership, and so this project was not further pursued. But interestingly enough, nowadays we find similar proposals again coming up in Peru and other Latin American countries. So we see this idea of running a country through what one would call algocracy is by no means dead. This brings us to technology convergence. You might know this gentleman. This gentleman is Neil Harbinson, the first officially recognized cyborg. And next to that is an example of what I would call cyberpig. And cyberpig is not to be mistaken for spiderpig. We had yesterday or the day before a Simpsons reference. Some of you might still remember spiderpig. But cyberpig is a reference to Neuralink, of course, the project of Elon Musk implanting sensors in the neural network of the brain, reading out the data and thereby helping to create brain and human interfaces. Now, the idea that Jenka and Dirk came up with of technological convergence means that we see an increasing ubiquity of pervasive distribution of computing capabilities across physical, biological, and so forth entities. And this means something also when we take into account that we said that all these mechanisms can be used to steer and to govern. They are designed to steer and to govern. So, in connection with that, we find the emergence of other tools that we are nowadays dealing with. And this is a paper we wrote in 2020 as well. You see, that was my productive period before deanship started. But we thought the future of identity, the future of where data is being held, needs to be somewhere where the person that holds the identity can also control that data. Now, you might know that there is no such thing as data ownership. It's not a legal concept. We have certain exceptions, or at least certain areas where data is administered in such a way that we have some control over it. Privacy law, you know, the GDPR, of course, but also intellectual property rights, copyright, and then when you look at national legislation, you find certain aspects connected to your citizenship, such as tax information or the right to your own image. But these are the legal bounds that we find already are sufficient, or at least these are not sufficient, but these are what we have. Now, the idea of self-sovereign identity management was to bring all the identity aspects that an individual holds into their control, allowing individuals to administrate who is allowed to know what about them. And of course, the EU is trying to pioneer with the European Identity Framework, pioneer this aspect further. But we also see a different process, a process where Google, Facebook, Apple, and so forth are also trying to occupy that space. And you might have seen it yourself that in more and more websites, you can now log in with your Google account, with your Facebook account, and so forth. Thus, centralizing again the management of the data that is being shared. Microsoft went a different route. Microsoft realized that what the EU is doing, and they decided, we are not going to get into the login battle. We are getting into the management battle, and said, we will provide for you, for the European Union, the organization or integration layer for self-sovereign identity management through Azure. And so they got into a battle with KPMG, who also tried to do that. Am I already running out of time? Slowly, yes. Let me then come slowly to the conclusion. Examples of this technology convergence can be found everywhere. And this is an example that I put together for the article that we wrote. This example concerns what is called the human platform. The human platform, a term developed by the British and the German military, is to create the super soldiers by integrating different technologies into this space. And what happens when we do that, we have not only technologies converging on the human platform, we have also laws converging on the human platform. These are just the laws that, based on those technologies that I have shown, are converging onto one legal subject. Now add to that all the other forms of governance that I've previously discussed, and you can see why we poor lawyers are struggling. And this brings me to my conclusion. I think what we need here is not to have only these principles converge and thereby creating a regulatory environment that reduces legal certainty. We also don't need to reduce regulatory variety, because that means incarcerating us more and more in our freedoms. What we need is to think about proper meta-regulations. Meta-regulations that thus allow us to steer us into the directions of principles that we can also ascribe to, ethical principles, and not micromanagement. Thank you very much.